It's hard at times, because you're waiting to be put to death. So that kind of breaks a little part of you every day. Kind of breaks you every day. And sometimes I have to catch myself, for being overwhelmed and stressed out, and like force myself to eat because it does that to you where you just don't want to do nothing.
On the evening of March 7, 2023, inside Texas's Huntsville unit, Stephen Llewellyn Nelson lay strapped to a gurney. At exactly 6:17 p.m., the state of Texas carried out his execution by lethal injection. He was 37 years old, convicted of murdering a pastor in his own church. His crime had shaken Arlington back in 2011. A young minister, Reverend Clint Dobson, just 28, beaten, gagged, and smothered to death. His secretary, Judy Elliott, left tied, bleeding, and barely alive. The same attack that took one life nearly claimed another. For many, the case was open and shut. A robbery, a brutal murder, a man already known for violence. The evidence looked damning: stolen property traced back to Nelson, Judy Elliott's eyewitness account, and his own criminal record. By 2012, a Texas jury sentenced him to death. For the community, it was justice. For Nelson, it was the start of a long, bitter fight with the state. Over the years, his story grew more complicated. His lawyers argued that his violent outbursts behind bars came from untreated mental illness, not just cruelty. Supporters claimed Texas ignored signs of a troubled man who never had proper care. Critics saw it differently: a repeat offender who brought chaos everywhere he went and never showed mercy to others. Behind bars, Nelson surprised many by finding love. He married in prison. His wife stood by him until the end, watching from behind glass as the execution began. His last meal was simple: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, pecan pie. His final words were quieter still: "I am sorry for the pain I caused. I pray you find peace. To my wife, I love you." At 6:17 p.m. the drugs flowed. Minutes later, it was over. But to understand how a Texas boy became a church killer, how he turned violent crime into a death sentence, how he still found marriage and love while waiting for death, and why the state refused to bend to claims of mental illness or mercy, we have to go back. Back to his childhood. Back to the streets where crime ruled. Back to the very beginning of Stephen Llewellyn Nelson. If you're drawn to stories of justice, betrayal, and the people who reach a point of no return, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth. Real cases, real consequences. The darkest corners of human decision, broken down into tiny pieces so you can see every detail and make your own conclusions better. Stephen Llewellyn Nelson entered the world on February 18, 1987, in Ada, Oklahoma. From the very beginning, his life was marked by instability, neglect, and violence that would shape the trajectory of his future. Born into a family struggling with dysfunction, Nelson's childhood would become a case study in how early trauma can set a person on a destructive path. His mother was largely absent from his life, often leaving Stephen and his siblings, including a deaf sister, alone for days at a time. These abandonments, sometimes lasting 3 to 4 days, left the children to fend for themselves while their mother disappeared without explanation. When she was present, she showed little interest in her children's well-being or development. Nelson's father was no better. When he was around, he was abusive toward both his children and wife, creating an atmosphere of fear and violence in the home. The pattern of abuse and neglect created a perfect storm for behavioral problems that would manifest early in Stephen's life. At just 3 years old, Nelson displayed disturbing behavior that should have been a warning sign. He attempted to set fire to his mother's bed, which was located in the living room of their home. This early fascination with fire and destruction was just the beginning of a pattern of increasingly dangerous behavior. By age 6, Nelson had his first encounters with Oklahoma's juvenile justice system. He was committing property crimes, burglaries, thefts, and even aggravated assault. Violent crimes that were shocking for someone so young. Despite attempts by social workers and juvenile authorities to intervene through counseling and probation programs, Nelson's behavior continued to escalate. Nelson's education was also disrupted by his chaotic home life and legal troubles. He managed to complete schooling only through the 11th grade before dropping out entirely. Without stable family support or educational achievement, he lacked the foundation that might have provided alternatives to a criminal lifestyle. The family eventually relocated to Texas, settling in Tarrant County, but the change of scenery did nothing to improve Nelson's trajectory. At age 14, Nelson faced charges that were serious enough to warrant intervention by Tarrant County's juvenile court. He was arrested for unauthorized use of a motor vehicle, burglary, and criminal trespassing, crimes that demonstrated both his disregard for property rights and his increasing boldness. The court sentenced him to an indeterminate term in a juvenile prison, a rare punishment for property crimes at his age. Originally sentenced to 9 months at the Texas Youth Commission facility, Nelson's stay was extended to over 3.5 years due to his continued misbehavior while incarcerated. He racked up numerous infractions and was subject to 4 high-level disciplinary hearings during his time in the facility. Rather than using his incarceration as an opportunity for rehabilitation, Nelson seemed to view it as just another environment in which to assert his defiance of authority. In 2005, at 18 years old, Nelson committed his first adult crime when he was arrested for driving a stolen car. This marked his transition from the juvenile justice system to adult criminal court, where the consequences would be more severe. However, the harsher potential penalties did little to deter his criminal activity. 2 years later, in November 2007, Nelson's crimes took on a more brazen quality. He stole a laptop from a Walmart by hiding it in his pants while pretending to be a store employee. The theft showed both planning and deception, as he had studied the store's operations enough to masquerade as staff. Just 1 week later, he was caught at a different Walmart in Arlington, this time stealing boots by simply wearing them out of the store without paying. These retail thefts demonstrated Nelson's growing comfort with stealing and his willingness to take increasing risks. The fact that he returned to criminal activities so quickly after the laptop theft showed that he was either unable or unwilling to learn from consequences. After serving time in state jail, Nelson was released in 2010, but his freedom was short-lived. He assaulted his girlfriend in an incident serious enough to result in charges of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. When his girlfriend initially filed a complaint, she later attempted to drop the charges by filing a non-prosecution affidavit. However, given Nelson's extensive criminal record, the district attorney refused to dismiss the case. The assault charge resulted in Nelson being placed on probation and ordered to complete a 90-day program at the Intermediate Sanctions Facility. This probation would still be active on March 3, 2011, the day that would change everything. Nelson was supposed to report to his probation officer that morning, but instead made a decision that would lead to murder and his eventual execution. During the same years that Steven Nelson was accumulating arrests and building a criminal record across Texas, another young man was following a completely different path. Clint Dobson was being shaped by faith, service, and a genuine desire to make a positive impact on the world. Born into a Christian family, Dobson's journey toward ministry began early and was marked by dedication, academic achievement, and a genuine love for people that would define his short but meaningful life. Dobson's spiritual foundation was established at University Baptist Church in Houston, where his family attended when he was just 4 years old. It was here that he first met Robert Creech, who was serving as pastor at the time and would later become a professor of Christian ministries at Baylor University. Creech watched Dobson grow from a young child into a committed teenager who was deeply invested in his church community. From an early age, Dobson demonstrated the qualities that would make him an effective minister. He was quick to smile, eager to embrace friends, and capable of conversations that could be lighthearted and full of laughter one moment, then dive into deep theological discussions the next. His friends and mentors noted that he had a rare combination of love for truth and love for people, qualities essential for effective pastoral ministry. Dobson's academic journey took him to Baylor University, where he pursued undergraduate studies while continuing to develop his calling to ministry. His time at Baylor was marked by academic excellence and leadership in religious activities. After graduating from Baylor in 2004, Dobson initially enrolled at New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary to pursue his Master of Divinity degree. However, Hurricane Katrina temporarily closed the school, forcing him to make alternative plans. Rather than seeing this as a setback, Dobson transferred to Baylor's Truth Theological Seminary, where he continued his theological education. Dobson's personal life was equally fulfilling. He married Laura, whom he described as his amazing wife, and together they began planning a future centered around ministry and service. Soon after Clint Dobson was selected as pastor of North Point Baptist Church in 2008, marked a turning point for the struggling congregation. The church had previously operated as Brown Boulevard Baptist Church, but it was facing significant challenges that threatened its survival. Declining membership, financial difficulties, and a lack of strong leadership had brought the congregation to a crossroads. Rather than allowing the church to close, First Baptist Church of Arlington intervened with financial support and the decision to hire a dynamic young pastor who could breathe new life into the ministry. Under Dobson's leadership, the church began to show signs of growth and renewed energy. His vision was simple but ambitious: to create a church filled with young families and children where the gospel could be shared in a welcoming, authentic environment. Dobson believed that effective ministry required both sound biblical teaching and genuine personal relationships with congregation members. Working alongside Dobson was Judy Elliott, a 69-year-old woman who served as the church secretary and administrative assistant. Elliott had become an integral part of the church's daily operations, handling everything from correspondence to scheduling to the countless details that keep a small church running smoothly. Dobson himself described Elliott as someone who kept everyone in line and everything moving forward. By early 2011, there were signs that Dobson's vision for the church was beginning to be realized. Attendance was growing, particularly among younger families attracted by his energetic preaching style and genuine care for people. The church was developing programs for children and youth, fulfilling Dobson's dream of creating a ministry that would impact multiple generations. The morning of March 3, 2011, began like any other at North Point Baptist Church. Pastor Clint Dobson arrived at his office to prepare for the day's activities, while Judy Elliott settled in at her desk to handle the church's administrative work. Neither could have predicted that this ordinary Thursday would end in violence that would claim one life and forever change another. Steven Nelson woke that morning with criminal intent. He was supposed to report to his probation officer that day, but had other plans. He had arranged to meet with two friends, Anthony Springs and Claude Jefferson, to plan what he called hitting a lick, street slang for committing a robbery. The three men had identified North Point Baptist Church as a target. Churches, they reasoned, might have cash from collections and would likely have valuable items like computers and electronics that could be easily sold. More importantly, churches typically had few people present during weekday hours, reducing the risk of confrontation or identification. Nelson's version of events, which he would maintain throughout his trial and appeals, was that he was supposed to serve as a lookout while Springs and Jefferson entered the church to commit the robbery. According to this account, Nelson waited outside while his accomplices went inside to steal valuables and cash. Dobson, who was in his office working on sermon preparation and administrative tasks, was apparently the first to be confronted. The young pastor who had dedicated his life to helping others found himself face to face with someone intent on violence. The attack on Dobson was methodical and cruel. He was struck repeatedly, possibly with the butt of a firearm, and some of his injuries appeared to have been caused by being beaten with the computer monitor stand from his office. After being beaten unconscious, A computer extension cord was used to strangle him, and finally a plastic bag was placed over his head, suffocating him to death. Judy Elliott, working at her desk in the church office, was also brutally attacked. The 69-year-old woman was beaten so severely that she suffered internal bleeding in her brain and traumatic injuries to her face, head, arms, legs, and back. After the attacks, the perpetrator stole several items from the church and from the victims. These included Dobson's laptop computer, a cell phone, Elliott's credit cards, and Elliott's cream-colored Mitsubishi Galant. The crime scene was left in disarray, with both victims lying unconscious and bleeding. As the afternoon wore on at North Point Baptist Church, an air of normalcy prevailed in the surrounding neighborhood. No one suspected that inside the modest church building, two people lay fighting for their lives after a brutal attack that morning. Laura Dobson, Clint's wife, began to worry when she couldn't reach her husband by phone. It wasn't like Clint to be unreachable for extended periods, especially during the workday when he was typically available for calls from congregation members or family. Her attempts to contact him throughout the afternoon met with no response. Growing concerned, Laura contacted Jake Turner, who served as the church's part-time music minister. Turner agreed to go to the church to check on Dobson and see if there was a simple explanation for his unavailability. Understanding that this might be a family emergency, Turner also called John Elliott, Judy's husband, to ask him to meet at the church. John Elliott arrived at North Point Baptist Church around 4 p.m., using his passcode to enter the building. What he discovered inside would haunt him for the rest of his life. The normally orderly church office was in complete disarray, with furniture overturned and papers scattered everywhere. But it was the sight of a severely beaten woman lying on the floor that truly shocked him. The woman was so badly injured that John initially didn't recognize her as his wife of many years. Judy Elliott's face was swollen and bloodied from the vicious beating she had endured. She was unconscious and barely breathing, having suffered traumatic injuries that would require immediate medical intervention to save her life. In his panic and shock, John didn't immediately see Pastor Dobson's body, which lay on the other side of the desk in the office. His first priority was getting help for the injured woman he now realized was his wife. He immediately called 911, setting in motion a response that would bring police, paramedics, and investigators to the scene. Arlington police officer Jesse Parrish was among the first responders to arrive at the church. It was Officer Parrish who discovered Dobson's body and confirmed what would soon be classified as a homicide. The young pastor was found with a plastic bag covering his face, the final act in a brutal assault that had already left him beaten and strangled. Paramedics worked frantically to stabilize Judy Elliott, whose injuries were so severe that doctors would later describe her survival as remarkable. She was rushed to a Fort Worth hospital, where medical teams battled to save her life. The internal bleeding in her brain and the extent of her other injuries made her prognosis uncertain. At the hospital, the full extent of Elliott's injuries became clear. In addition to the brain trauma, she had suffered a heart attack during the assault, adding to the life-threatening nature of her condition. Her face had been beaten so badly that reconstructive surgery would be required, eventually involving a permanent combination of mesh, screws, and other metal components to support her facial structure. As word of the attack spread through the community, members of both North Point Baptist Church and First Baptist Arlington began gathering at the hospital and the church. The idea that their beloved pastor had been murdered and their church secretary left for dead was almost incomprehensible to people who had dedicated their lives to serving others. The Arlington Police Department launched an immediate and comprehensive investigation into the brutal attack at North Point Baptist Church. Detectives understood that they were dealing with a case that had shocked the community and demanded swift action to identify and apprehend those responsible. The combination of murder and attempted murder during a church robbery made this a high-priority case. Lead investigators began by processing the crime scene methodically. Fingerprints were lifted from various surfaces, including areas where the attacker had clearly spent time searching for valuables. Blood evidence was collected and preserved for DNA analysis. One of the most significant pieces of physical evidence was a broken belt, with metal studs scattered around the crime scene. The condition of the belt suggested it had been damaged during a violent struggle, possibly when the attacker was restraining or beating the victims. This would later become a crucial link to Steven Nelson. The missing items provided investigators with their most immediate leads. Judy Elliott's cream-colored Mitsubishi Galant with Texas license plate DFR 352 was broadcast in a statewide alert. Her credit cards were flagged in the system so that any attempted use would trigger an immediate notification to police. Detectives also began interviewing members of the church congregation and anyone who might have had contact with Pastor Dobson or Judy Elliott in the days leading up to the attack. They were looking for any signs that the church had been under surveillance or that someone had been planning this crime in advance. The first major break in the case came when Elliott's stolen credit cards were used at local businesses. Surveillance footage from these locations showed a young African-American man using the cards to purchase clothing and jewelry. The footage wasn't immediately clear enough to make a positive identification, but it provided investigators with their first glimpse of a potential suspect. More importantly, the stolen Mitsubishi Galant was spotted by police officers who had been alerted to watch for the vehicle. When officers attempted to stop the car, it led them to an apartment complex less than a mile from North Point Baptist Church. This proximity to the crime scene was significant and suggested that the perpetrator was familiar with the local area. The pursuit ended when the driver abandoned the vehicle and fled on foot into the apartment complex. However, police had gotten close enough to see that the driver matched the general description of the man seen using Elliott's credit cards. A search of the apartment complex led to the arrest of Steven Nelson, who was found hiding in one of the buildings. When Nelson was arrested, he was found in possession of several items that immediately linked him to the crime. He had Pastor Dobson's laptop computer in his possession, along with Elliott's credit cards and other personal items stolen from the church. The discovery of these items in Nelson's possession provided investigators with strong evidence of his involvement in the robbery. During the initial questioning, Nelson claimed that he had purchased the laptop from someone else and denied any knowledge of how the other items came into his possession. However, investigators noted that his stories were inconsistent and contained obvious fabrications. A search of Nelson's clothing revealed what would become some of the most damning evidence against him. Forensic analysis of his shoes showed bloodstains that contained DNA matching both Pastor Dobson and Judy Elliott. The presence of both victims' blood on his footwear strongly suggested that he had been present during the violent attacks. Additional forensic evidence continued to build the case against Nelson. His fingerprints were found at the crime scene, including on surfaces that the attacker would have touched while searching for valuables. The metal studs from the broken belt found at the scene were later matched to a belt that Nelson had been wearing. Investigators also discovered that Nelson had been selling the stolen laptop computer to local buyers, attempting to convert the stolen property into cash. These transactions provided additional evidence of his knowledge that the items were stolen and his active participation in disposing of them. The investigation revealed that Nelson was supposed to have reported to his probation officer on March 3rd, the day of the attack, but had failed to do so. This violation of his probation terms provided additional motivation for his arrest and prosecution. While Steven Nelson awaited trial for the murder of Pastor Clint Dobson, his behavior in the Tarrant County Jail would provide prosecutors with additional evidence of his violent nature and complete disregard for human life. Far from using his incarceration as an opportunity for reflection or remorse, Nelson continued to demonstrate the dangerous tendencies that had led to murder. The most serious incident occurred on March 19, 2012, exactly 1 year and 16 days after the church attack, when Nelson allegedly murdered a mentally ill fellow inmate named Jonathan Holden. This crime would never result in formal charges, but it would become crucial evidence during the penalty phase of Nelson's trial as prosecutors argued for the death penalty. This incident would become a pivotal moment in Steven Nelson's case, not because he was formally charged, but because it revealed his character to the jury. These moments in true crime cases force us to confront difficult questions about justice, rehabilitation, and public safety. How do we balance punishment with protection? How do we prevent future violence while addressing past crimes? We encourage thoughtful discussion about these complex issues in the comments below. Your perspectives matter as we collectively grapple with these challenging questions. Now, let's return to see how this incident would influence the most important decision of all: whether Steven Nelson would live or die for his crimes. Jonathan Holden was a 30-year-old man with paranoid schizophrenia who had never been able to live independently due to his mental illness. He typically lived with family members who could provide the care and supervision he needed to function safely. Holden had been arrested on minor theft charges and found himself housed in the same high-security prison as Nelson while awaiting trial. The incident that led to Holden's death began when he allegedly made a racial slur directed toward African Americans within earshot of other prisoners. While Holden and Nelson were housed in individual cells rather than sharing space, the comment reportedly angered several inmates, including Nelson, who was African American. What happened next revealed the calculating and predatory nature of Nelson's violence. Rather than simply confronting Holden or ignoring the comment, Nelson devised a plan that would result in the mentally ill man's death, while potentially allowing him to avoid responsibility for the murder. Nelson approached Holden's cell and convinced him to participate in what he described as a fake suicide attempt. According to witness accounts, Nelson told Holden that by staging a suicide attempt, he could get himself transferred to another part of the prison, presumably away from the other angry inmates who had been offended by his comment. Holden, whose mental illness made him vulnerable to manipulation and unable to fully grasp the consequences of his actions, agreed to Nelson's plan. Nelson fashioned a noose from blankets and instructed Holden on how to position himself at the cell bars to make the staged attempt look convincing. Once Holden had placed the makeshift noose around his neck, Nelson's true intentions became horrifyingly clear. Rather than helping Holden stage a fake attempt as promised, Nelson used his position outside the cell to tighten the blanket around Holden's neck. He placed his feet against the bars for leverage and pulled on the blanket with both hands, effectively strangling Holden against the cell wall and lifting him nearly off his feet. The attack continued for several agonizing minutes, with Holden unable to free himself from the noose or fight off Nelson's assault from outside the cell. Other inmates in the pod witnessed the attack but were unable or unwilling to intervene effectively. Holden died after approximately 4 minutes of strangulation, while Nelson maintained his deadly grip on the improvised weapon. According to witness statements from other inmates, Nelson's behavior after Holden's death was particularly disturbing and revealed his complete lack of remorse or human empathy. Several prisoners reported that he performed what they described as a celebration dance and used a broom as if it were a guitar, apparently celebrating his successful murder of the defenseless, mentally ill man. When jailers discovered Holden's body during their next security check, the death was initially classified as a suicide, exactly as Nelson had planned. However, the medical examiner's thorough investigation revealed evidence that this was actually a homicide, leading to a reclassification of the death and an investigation into the circumstances surrounding it. In 2014, 2 years after Holden's death, his family filed a civil rights lawsuit against Tarrant County over the failure to protect their vulnerable family member from a known violent offender. The lawsuit highlighted the inadequate supervision and protection provided to mentally ill inmates housed near dangerous criminals. The family eventually settled the case for $350,000, though no amount of money could restore the life that had been lost to Nelson's calculated violence. As Steven Nelson's trial approached in the fall of 2012, both the prosecution and defense teams faced the challenge of presenting their cases in one of the most high-profile murder trials in Tarrant County's recent history. The brutal nature of Pastor Clint Dobson's murder and the community's emotional investment in the case created intense pressure on all involved in the legal proceedings. The prosecution team, led by the Tarrant County District Attorney's Office, had built what they considered an overwhelming case against Nelson. Prosecutors faced a critical decision about whether to seek the death penalty. Given the heinous nature of the crime, the murder of a pastor during a church robbery, and Nelson's extensive criminal history, the decision was made to pursue capital punishment. This choice would require the prosecution to prove not only Nelson's guilt, but also that he posed a continuing threat to society and that the crime was particularly heinous. The defense team faced a much more challenging task. The physical evidence against their client was substantial and seemingly irrefutable. Rather than attempting to argue complete innocence, defense attorneys developed a strategy that acknowledged Nelson's presence at the crime scene while shifting responsibility for the actual murder to others. Central to the defense strategy was Nelson's claim that he had been involved in planning a robbery, but had not committed the actual violence against Pastor Dobson and Judy Elliott. According to this version of events, Nelson had served as a lookout while two accomplices, Anthony Springs and Claude Jefferson, had entered the church and committed the attacks. This strategy presented several challenges for the defense. First, they needed to explain how Nelson had come to possess the stolen items and why the victim's blood was found on his clothing if he had remained outside during the attacks. Second, they needed to address the question of why Springs and Jefferson had not been prosecuted if they were the actual killers. The defense's explanation for the physical evidence was that Nelson had entered the church after the attacks to steal items, requiring him to step over or around the injured victims. This, they argued, would explain the presence of blood on his shoes and his fingerprints on various surfaces without making him responsible for the violence itself. Regarding the failure to prosecute the alleged accomplices, the defense argued that investigators had not adequately explored their involvement and that both men had alibis that were not properly challenged. Claude Jefferson claimed to have been attending a chemistry class at his university during the time of the attack, while Anthony Springs' cell phone records suggested he was approximately 30 miles away from the church. The prosecution prepared to counter these arguments by presenting evidence that the alleged alibis were fabricated or unreliable. They noted that when defense investigators contacted Jefferson's professor about the chemistry class, the professor stated there was no chemistry test scheduled for that day, contradicting Jefferson's alibi. Both sides prepared for the emotional impact of victim testimony. Laura Dobson, Clint's widow, would testify about her husband's character and the impact of his death on her life and their community.